The forbidden depths. The vast expanse of the North Atlantic was a world of cold winds, restless waves, and secrets buried beneath its icy depths. For Jack Morrison, a seasoned oil rig inspector with over a decade of experience, it was just another routine assignment, or so he thought. Jack had been assigned to the Lament Horizon, a sprawling offshore rig known for its high productivity and equally high turnover rate. The rumors surrounding the rig were peculiar at best, disturbing at worst. Workers whispered of strange sounds echoing through the metal corridors and shadows that moved where no light should touch. But Jack, ever the skeptic, dismissed such tales as the product of isolation and overactive imaginations. Jack arrived at the rig on a gray morning, the helicopter's blades slicing through a sky heavy with storm clouds. The rig loomed on the horizon like a skeletal fortress, its towering cranes and tangled pipelines silhouetted against the dim light. As the helicopter touched down, he was greeted by the site manager, a grizzled man named Carter Hayes. Carter's face bore the hardened expression of someone who'd seen too much and spoken too little. "Welcome to the horizon," Carter said, his voice gruff. "You got your work cut out for you." Jack's inspection began the next morning. Armed with his clipboard and a flashlight, he ventured into the rig's labyrinthine structure. The air was thick with the tang of salt and oil, and the constant hum of machinery reverberated through the walls. The deeper he went, the more Jack noticed something off. There were doors marked with warning signs he hadn't seen on any other rig. "Authorized personnel only," one read in bold, red letters. Another bore the cryptic phrase, "Do not open after dark." Jack asked Carter about the signs during lunch in the rig's mess hall. "What's with the restricted areas?" he inquired, keeping his tone casual. Carter's fork paused mid-air, his expression darkening. "Safety precautions," he said curtly. "We're sitting on a volatile reserve. Can't have anyone wandering where they shouldn't." Jack nodded, but his curiosity was piqued. He decided to dig deeper, both figuratively and literally. That evening, when most of the crew were either asleep or huddled in the recreational room, Jack returned to one of the restricted doors. The corridor was eerily silent, the hum of machinery a distant murmur. His flashlight beam danced across the metal door, illuminating the warning sign. Taking a deep breath, Jack tried the handle. It was locked as expected, but Jack had anticipated this. From his pocket, he produced a set of universal keys, a perk of his position as an inspector. The lock clicked open, and the door creaked ajar. Beyond was a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the bowels of the rig. The air grew colder with each step, and an unnatural stillness replaced the rhythmic sounds of the upper levels. Jack's unease grew with every echo of his footsteps. At the bottom of the staircase, he found himself in a cavernous chamber lined with archaic machinery. The walls were damp, and a faint, sulfuric odor permeated the air. In the center of the room was a grated floor, beneath which lay a pool of black, viscous liquid. It wasn't oil. Jack knew oil. This was something else, something alive. The surface shimmered with an iridescent hue, and faint ripples moved as though disturbed by an unseen force. As Jack crouched for a closer look, a voice crackled over his radio. "Morrison, where are you?" It was Carter, and he sounded agitated. Jack fumbled to respond. "Just checking the lower levels," he lied. "Get back to the main deck. Now." The urgency in Carter's tone was unmistakable. Reluctantly, Jack climbed back up the staircase, leaving the strange liquid behind. When he emerged into the corridor, Carter was waiting for him, his face a mask of controlled anger. "You don't belong down there," Carter said, his voice low and menacing. Jack crossed his arms, defiance in his posture. "I'm here to inspect every part of this rig. That includes whatever you're hiding down there." Carter stepped closer, his weathered face inches from Jack's. "Some things are better left alone," he said. "For your sake and everyone else's." Jack wanted to argue, but the look in Carter's eyes, a mix of fear and desperation, gave him pause. Reluctantly, he returned to his quarters, but sleep eluded him. His mind was a whirlpool of questions. What was that liquid? Why was it hidden? And why did Carter seem so afraid? The first incident. The next day, the rig was abuzz with activity. Jack decided to focus on the inspection to avoid raising further suspicion. But as the day wore on, strange occurrences began to pile up. Tools went missing only to reappear in places they didn't belong. Workers reported hearing whispers in empty corridors. And then there was the incident with the crane operator. Around midday, a piercing scream cut through the din of the rig's operations. Jack and several crew members rushed to the source of the noise, the crane platform. The operator, a young man named Luis, was clutching his head and muttering incoherently. His eyes were wide with terror, and his skin was deathly pale. "I saw it," he screamed. "In the water! It's watching us!" Luis was taken to the infirmary, where the medic sedated him. Jack questioned the crew, but their accounts were vague. One worker claimed to have seen a shadowy shape beneath the waves, but most dismissed Luis's outburst as the result of stress or an overactive imagination. Jack wasn't so sure. That evening, he stood on the rig's edge, staring into the churning waters below. The North Atlantic was a forbidding expanse, its depths concealing more than marine life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack thought he saw a faint glow emanating from the ocean's surface. It pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. A sudden hand on his shoulder made him jump. It was Carter. "You need to leave," Carter said, his voice softer this time. "Transfer out. Go back to the mainland." Jack shook his head. "Not until I know the truth." Carter sighed, his shoulders sagging. "You're not the first inspector to ask questions. None of them stayed long enough to get answers." "What happens if I stay?" Jack asked. Carter didn't reply. Instead, he walked away, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts and the ominous glow below. A terrible discovery. Unable to let go of his curiosity, Jack returned to the restricted chamber the following night. This time he brought a sample kit. As he descended the staircase, the air grew heavier, each breath a laborious effort. When he reached the grated floor, the liquid was more active than before, its surface roiling with movement. Jack crouched and lowered a small vial into the pool. The moment the vial touched the liquid, a jolt of energy surged through Jack's body. His vision blurred, and for a fleeting moment, he saw something. A vast, writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, its form too immense and grotesque to comprehend. It was as though the liquid had shared a fragment of its essence, and it was enough to make Jack stagger backward, his mind reeling. He stumbled up the staircase, clutching the vial like a lifeline. When he emerged into the corridor, he collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a substance. It was alive, and it was aware. Jack knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. But as he reached for his radio to call the mainland, the lights flickered, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the rig. It wasn't machinery. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. Beneath the surface, the cold grip of unease clung to each crew member as the oil rig's engines hummed against the backdrop of the roaring Atlantic. Captain Harris convened the crew in the dimly lit mess hall, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously. Tension hung thick in the air. "Something isn't right," Harris began, his voice steady but laced with concern. "I don't know what we're dealing with, but it's clear this rig is hiding secrets. We need to stick together and figure this out." A murmur of agreement swept through the room, but the anxiety was palpable. It wasn't just the sudden loss of communication or the strange power outages. It was the feeling, that gnawing sense of being watched. Discovery in the depths. That evening, Harris assigned tasks. Jonas, the engineer, and Sarah, the geologist, were to inspect the lower decks for structural issues. The rest of the crew would stay on the upper levels to monitor the rig systems and keep watch for any external anomalies. Jonas and Sarah descended into the bowels of the rig armed with flashlights and a toolkit. The corridors were narrow, with pipes snaking along the walls and ceilings. Shadows danced in the dim light, giving life to the inanimate machinery. A faint, otherworldly hum seemed to emanate from the metal beneath their feet. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, stopping in her tracks. Jonas tilted his head, listening intently. "Yeah," he muttered. "It's like a vibration, but it's not coming from the engines." As they ventured deeper, the sound grew louder, more distinct, a rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of something enormous. It led them to an old, sealed hatch marked with faded warning signs. "This doesn't show up on the rig's blueprints," Jonas noted, frowning. "It's like someone wanted to keep this hidden." Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. "Let's open it." Jonas hesitated, but eventually relented. Using his tools, he pried open the rusted hatch. A blast of cold, stale air rushed out, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Beyond the hatch was a dark, spiraling staircase that seemed to descend endlessly. A chilling encounter. Meanwhile, on the upper levels, the remaining crew kept watch. Jake, the radio operator, attempted to re-establish contact with the mainland. The static-filled radio crackled sporadically, but no coherent messages came through. Then, without warning, a voice emerged from the static. "Leave before it's too late." Jake froze, his blood running cold. "Hello? Who is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. The response was garbled, but one word was clear: depths. At the same time, the rig shuddered violently, as though something massive had struck its base. The crew scrambled to stabilize the structure, their fear mounting with each passing second. "What the hell is going on?" one of the workers shouted, clutching a railing for support. Down below, Jonas and Sarah were unaware of the chaos above. They had descended the staircase and found themselves in a cavernous chamber filled with strange, bioluminescent growths clinging to the walls. The pulsating hum was deafening now, resonating through their very bones. In the center of the chamber lay an enormous, organic structure, a cocoon-like mass pulsating with a sickly green light. Tendrils extended from it, weaving through the chamber like veins. Sarah approached it cautiously, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "This isn't natural," she whispered. "It's alive." Before Jonas could respond, the cocoon shuddered. A low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber, and the tendrils began to writhe. Jonas grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now!" Unseen forces. As they raced back up the staircase, the rig groaned and creaked around them. The strange hum seemed to follow them, growing louder with every step. When they finally emerged onto the lower deck, they found the corridor engulfed in darkness. "Jonas?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their labored breathing. A shadow moved at the edge of their flashlight beams. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a jolt of fear through both of them. "We're not alone," Jonas said, his voice tight. The shadow darted again, this time accompanied by a guttural clicking sound. Sarah gripped Jonas's arm, her flashlight shaking uncontrollably. "Run," Jonas said, barely above a whisper. They sprinted down the corridor, the clicking sounds growing closer. When they finally reached the mess hall, they slammed the door shut behind them, barricading it with whatever they could find. The rest of the crew stared at them, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. "What happened?" Harris demanded. Jonas tried to catch his breath. "There's something down there, something alive." As if on cue, the rig shuddered again, and the lights flickered violently. A deep, guttural roar reverberated through the walls, silencing everyone. "The warning!" Jake burst into the room, his face pale. "The radio, it's not just static anymore. Someone's trying to warn us. They said we need to leave." Harris looked around at his crew, their fear mirrored in his own eyes. "We're not leaving until we know what's going on here." Before anyone could argue, the door to the mess hall rattled violently, as though something massive was trying to force its way in. The crew backed away, their makeshift barricade trembling under the assault. And then, the door began to splinter. The shattering descent. The door exploded inward with a deafening crash, sending shards of wood and metal flying across the mess hall. The crew scattered, shielding themselves as a cold, damp wind swept through the room, carrying with it the putrid stench of rot and seawater. In the shattered doorway, the light flickered, casting ominous shadows across the walls. Something moved, a hulking silhouette, obscured by the dimness. Its breathing was deep and guttural, like the rasping of something ancient and alien. "Everyone back!" Captain Harris bellowed, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall. The makeshift weapon felt pitifully inadequate in his hands. The creature stepped into the light, and the crew froze in collective horror. It was humanoid, but its body was grotesquely distorted, its skin glistening with a slick, black sheen. Webbed hands ended in jagged claws, and its elongated face was dominated by lidless eyes and a maw filled with needle-like teeth. Sarah stumbled back, her voice trembling. "That thing, it came from down there?" The creature snarled, its unblinking eyes fixed on the crew. With terrifying speed, it lunged toward Jake, who had been nearest to the door. Jake barely had time to scream before the creature's claws raked across his shoulder, sending him sprawling. Harris swung the fire extinguisher, striking the creature with all his strength. The metal tank connected with a sickening thud, and the creature reeled back, screeching in pain. "Get out! Now!" Harris shouted. Desperate retreat. The crew bolted from the mess hall, dragging the injured Jake with them. The corridor was a maze of flickering lights and trembling metal. Behind them, the creature let out a bone-chilling roar, its heavy footsteps echoing as it pursued them. "We need to get to the control room," Harris yelled, leading the group toward the rig's central hub. As they ran, the rig continued to shudder violently. The walls seemed to close in, and the strange hum from below grew louder, merging with the creature's enraged cries. It felt as though the entire structure was alive, writhing and groaning under some unseen force. When they reached the control room, Harris slammed the door shut and locked it. The crew collapsed against the walls, panting and shaking. Jake groaned, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "That thing," Jonas gasped, his face pale. "It's not alone. There's more of them." Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" Jonas hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That cocoon, it wasn't empty. There were others, smaller ones, breaking out of their shells." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. A terrifying revelation. Harris approached the control panel, his hands trembling as he accessed the rig's surveillance system. The grainy feeds from the lower decks revealed the nightmare Jonas had described. The chamber they had discovered was teeming with movement. Dozens of smaller creatures scuttling across the walls and floor, their grotesque forms illuminated by the sickly green glow. "We're sitting on a nest," Harris muttered, his voice hollow. Sarah stared at the screen, her mind racing. "This isn't natural. It's like they've adapted to the rig, using it as a breeding ground." Jake groaned from the corner, his face pale and slick with sweat. His breathing was labored, and his wound had started to darken around the edges, veins spidering out from the injury. "Something's wrong with him," one of the crew members said, backing away. Sarah knelt beside Jake, inspecting the wound. "It's infected, but not like anything I've seen before. It's spreading too fast." Jake's eyes fluttered open, and he grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength. "You have to stop them," he rasped. "Burn it. Burn them all." His body convulsed violently, and he let out a guttural scream. Before anyone could react, his skin began to blister and crack, a black, viscous fluid seeping from the wounds. "He's turning," Jonas shouted, pulling Sarah back. An impossible choice. Jake's transformation was horrifyingly fast. His body contorted, bones snapping and reshaping as he let out a series of inhuman shrieks. The crew scrambled to the far side of the room, their faces pale with terror. "We can't let him stay in here," Harris yelled, grabbing a crowbar. "But he's one of us," Sarah protested, tears streaming down her face. "Not anymore," Harris said grimly. As Jake's transformation completed, he lunged toward the crew, his movements jerky and unnatural. Harris swung the crowbar with all his strength, striking Jake's malformed skull. The creature that had once been their friend collapsed, its body twitching before going still. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Sarah's quiet sobs. The final stand. "We need to end this," Harris said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "If we don't destroy that nest, those things will spread. They'll make it to the mainland." Jonas nodded. "The only way to stop them is to destroy the rig. We'll have to overload the system and detonate the fuel reserves." "That'll kill us all," one of the crew members said, his voice trembling. Harris met his gaze, his expression resolute. "Better us than the rest of the world." The crew exchanged grim looks before nodding in agreement. A race against time. As the creatures outside continued to batter against the control room door, the crew worked frantically to rig the system for a controlled detonation. Harris and Jonas coordinated the process while Sarah monitored the surveillance feeds, watching as the creatures began to swarm the upper levels. "We don't have much time," Sarah warned. The hum from below grew deafening, and the rig groaned as if in protest. The lights flickered one final time before plunging the room into darkness. A single, blood-red emergency light flickered to life, casting long, menacing shadows across the walls. "They're here," Jonas whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of claws scraping against metal. Cliffhanger. As the door buckled under the weight of the creatures, Harris stared at the countdown timer on the control panel. "Get ready," he said, gripping the crowbar tightly. The door gave way, and the creatures poured into the room, their unearthly screams filling the air. And then, the screen went black. The abyss beckons. The door to the mess hall groaned under the relentless assault, splinters flying with each crash. Captain Harris grabbed a fire axe from the wall, his knuckles white with tension. "Everyone stay behind me," he commanded, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. The barricade gave way, and the door burst open. But instead of the monstrous form they had feared, an eerie silence filled the room. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering with the stuttering lights. The crew held their breath, listening for any sound. And then they saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, humanoid but grotesquely distorted. Its elongated limbs and translucent skin revealed veins glowing with the same sickly green light as the cocoon below. Its hollow, glowing eyes locked onto them, unblinking. The creature let out a guttural screech, sending the crew into a panic. "Run!" Harris bellowed, swinging the axe as the crew scattered. The blade connected, but the creature barely flinched. It lashed out, sending Harris sprawling across the room. Jake, Jonas, Sarah, and a handful of others bolted into the corridors, the sound of their footsteps drowned by the cacophony of screeches and shouts. The final revelation. The group stumbled into the control room, slamming the door shut behind them. Jonas locked it with trembling hands. Sarah rushed to the control panel, her fingers flying across the keys. "What are you doing?" Jake asked, panic etched on his face. "Trying to figure out what this thing is," she replied. "If we can't fight it, we need to know how to stop it." Jonas pointed to the radar. "Look, there's something massive directly beneath the rig." Sarah's face paled as the system displayed a 3D scan of the ocean floor. The structure beneath the rig wasn't natural. It was a sprawling, organic mass that pulsed like a beating heart. Tendrils extended from it, wrapping around the rig's foundation. "This isn't just a nest," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's alive. The entire structure. It's a part of it." As she spoke, the control panel flickered and died. The room plunged into darkness, lit only by the glow of the creature's tendrils now creeping under the door. "Escape plan? We have to destroy the rig," Harris said, limping into the room, blood staining his shirt. "It's the only way to stop it." "You're insane," Jake shouted. "We'll die with it. If we don't, this thing will spread," Harris countered. "It's already feeding off the rig's power. Who knows how far it can go if we let it escape?" Jonas nodded grimly. "The emergency charges. They're rigged to the base structure. We can trigger them remotely, but someone needs to manually prime the detonator down below." The room fell silent as the weight of the plan sank in. Harris straightened. "I'll do it. You all take the lifeboats and get out of here." "No way," Sarah said. "You'll need help. I'm going with you." Jonas handed her a flare gun. "If you don't make it back, we'll finish the job." The descent. Harris and Sarah descended into the rig's depths one final time. The hum had grown deafening, the air thick with an unearthly energy. The cocoon in the cavern now throbbed violently, as if sensing their approach. Tendrils writhed, blocking their path. Harris swung his axe, hacking through the organic mass while Sarah planted the charges. The cocoon split open, revealing a creature unlike anything they had ever seen. A massive, otherworldly being with limbs that seemed to shift and stretch like liquid shadow. Its glowing eyes fixated on them, and a sound like a deep, resonant growl reverberated through the chamber. "Sarah now?" Harris shouted, throwing himself at the creature to buy her time. Sarah finished priming the detonator and fired the flare gun into the cocoon. The fire caught instantly, spreading across the chamber in a blaze of sickly green and orange. "Run!" Harris screamed. Sacrifice and survival. The two raced up the staircase as the rig trembled violently. Explosions echoed below, and the structure began to collapse. Tendrils lashed out, narrowly missing them as they ascended. On the surface, the remaining crew crowded into the lifeboats, watching in horror as the rig was consumed by flames and debris. Jake and Jonas scanned the exit hatch anxiously. "There!" Jonas shouted, pointing as Harris and Sarah emerged, coughing and battered. The crew pulled them into the lifeboat just as the rig's final explosions sent a massive shockwave through the water. The monstrous mass below glowed one last time before sinking into the abyss. The aftermath. Hours later, as the lifeboat drifted on the open sea, the survivors sat in stunned silence. The once roaring Atlantic was now eerily calm. The rigs remained smoldering on the horizon. Harris broke the silence. "We did what we had to. But what was it?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "And was it the only one?" No one had an answer. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, the survivors could only hope that the horrors they'd faced would remain buried in the depths. But deep beneath the Atlantic, the faint glow of tendrils began to stir once more.